and legislative debrief. My name is Rebecca Saldaña. I am the state senator of the 37th Legislative District, and I'm so glad to know that many of our neighbors are interested in joining us on this really ominous day. So many folks today are reeling by what was leaked by the Supreme Court of our United States of America, and what this, if it's true, what it means in terms of an attack on the right to privacy, and really rolling back in the wrong direction interpretation of our US Constitution and what it should strive to be. And this is about making sure that our bodies and our healthcare is healthcare. Reproductive justice needs to be centered because it is what makes families and communities strong. And so today, I just want, I had the honor and opportunity to be at a rally earlier today with legislators and our US delegation, making sure that people know whatever happens in the other Washington and this Washington, people's rights are protected. It is then before the 1970s, the voters stood up and said that women's bodies are their bodies and that they need to be protected, and abortion is a right in Washington state today. But all of our rights are only rights today if we do not make sure that our democracy is strong, that it is representative, that it is reflective, and that it is accountable to the highest ideals of what it means to be we the people. And that is not something that we can take for granted. And I'm really honored this evening to be joined with 10 other individuals who represent communities and organizations, and many of them are rooted in the 37th Legislative District. And because our democracy is not just who you send to represent you in the legislature, it is about the people engaging with the legislature and making sure that we are listening to what are the people's needs, what is urgent, what is important, and then our job is to try to legislate on behalf and with communities most impacted by our state government. And so I am very honored to introduce to you this evening, we have a panel of folks that are going to share with you who they are, how they engage with the legislature this session, maybe a victory if they have one, a challenge or disappointment if that is where they are at, and a takeaway that they want and the people of the 37th to know, so that we can make sure that we are making on behalf of the 37th a really responsive and better democracy. With that, I'm first going to pass it over. Oh, before I pass it over, I just want to give a little bit of technical considerations. Hopefully you can all hear me. Those that have joined us, we have over 22 participants on this Zoom, and we know that when we stream that there will be others also watching this. If you're on the Zoom, there is a Q&A. We also have received questions via email for when people RSVP'd. So we are going to try to get to as many of those questions as we can in the second half of the program. The first half is showcasing some of the incredible work and some of the incredible partners that our office had the honor to work with. And so with that, I'm now going to introduce and pass it to Jazzy B. Bryant from Surge Northwest and Doulas for All, to introduce themselves.
Hi, thank you so much for this opportunity to join you. I'm Jasmine Bryant. I go by Jazzy B in community. I use she and that and they pronouns. I'm a full spectrum doula. I'm a sleep and lactation educator. I'm also a birth justice organizer at Surge Reproductive Justice and co-facilitator of the Doulas for All Coalition. We've had a lot of wins this year. We're pretty ecstatic. We had overwhelming bipartisan support of our bill, HB 1881, which establishes birth doulas as a profession by creating a voluntary competency-based state certification pathway for birth doulas. And this is one step closer to getting Medicaid reimbursements for birth doulas. And a birth doula, if you don't know, means a person that's a non-medical birth coach or support person trained to provide physical, emotional, and informational support to birthing persons during pregnancy, antepartum, which is right before labor, that whole laboring process, the birth itself, and the postpartum period. Birth doulas advocate for and support birthing people and families to self-advocate by helping them to know their rights and make informed decisions. Birth doulas are not midwives or OBs. We do not provide medical care. We really fill the gap in the medical system, and the role of a birth doula is really traditionally a family member. But folks really need birth doulas, especially folks whose familial bonds or ancestral knowledge around birth was not passed down within their family or their community. Communities who need doulas the most are Black and Indigenous people of color, queer and trans folks, birthing people with active or even recovered addiction, birthing people who are houseless or housing insecure, incarcerated folks, families in the military, immigrant families who are far from their extended folks. And we're really excited to be one step closer to getting those folks access to doulas under Medicaid. One gap still remains, really, and I think that it becomes even more critical during these times because this process is going to be a long process. We've got a long way to go. And as the Doulas for All Coalition builds out our competencies, Black and Indigenous birthing people and their babies are still in danger. The goal of this legislation was never just to create a profession. It's a means of addressing the Black and Indigenous perinatal health crisis and advocating beyond reproductive rights to reproductive justice, where we all have the human right to have children, not have children, and parent those children in safe and thriving communities. And I learned a lot during this legislative session, but mostly I learned that a community-led lobbying strategy is possible. There is a culture of compromise and quid pro quos in the legislative process where bills start one way, focusing on a community, and end up in a very different space, and that community that it was meant for gets erased or forgotten as a way to get this bill through. Yet we maintain the original bill language, which included gender inclusive language, which is unprecedented, and we conducted a queer, trans, Black, and Indigenous people of color community-led lobbying campaign where the doulas most impacted by this bill were the leaders in making this policy happen. And it was more than a policy, it was a process of community-led leadership and power. And we want to see that kind of lobbying and strategy be normalized and embraced throughout the legislative process. That's how the system can do better. Listening to leaders who belong to the communities most impacted. And I said that we have a long way to go. I'll share with you what we have next. We have an 18-month rulemaking process coming up where the leadership at the Doulas for All Coalition will work with the Healthcare Authority and the Department of Health to build out these competencies of the state certification pathway, making sure, again, that our leaders are in the room and that this is an equitable process and something we believe in and will enroll in when it's done. And we'll be back. In 2024, we're going to be back in the legislature to establish a livable reimbursement rate, livable is keyword, and complete this journey of Medicaid reimbursements for doulas and allowing that 52% of births covered under Medicaid to have access to this life-saving holistic perinatal care. Thank you.
Thank you so much. The next group that we're inviting is Joe Kendo from Washington State Labor Council and Brenda Weiss from Teamsters 117.
Hey, thank you so much. I super appreciate the invitation, and it's just a real honor to join all of you here today. So my name is Joe Kendo. I'm the Government Affairs Director at the Washington State Labor Council. So we are a council of about 600 local unions that represent about 500,000 workers across the state in basically any industry you can think of. There's a unionized workforce, and we're very likely, and they're very likely affiliated with us. We always have a really robust agenda moving into the legislative session, given the broad scope and diversity of the unions that we represent. But we were focused, I'd say, on three major areas of policy this year. One was workforce development, and so we worked very closely with the members of the Labor Committee, including Senator Saldaña, on two really important apprenticeship expansion bills to help grow kind of the earn while you learn model in industries where they aren't typical and not necessarily traditional, so that folks can get post-secondary education kind of outside of a college setting that's very hands-on and earn a living while they do that, usually and often at no cost to them. We were also quite pleased with the transportation package that passed. Obviously, anything that large has a couple of warts, but we really appreciated the major investments in transit and multimodal investments, the innovative approach to funding it. Wish that there wasn't ongoing general fund investments. Unfortunately, that did hang at the end there, but we did appreciate the investment in infrastructure in those jobs. And then very, very proud of the legislative staff for the work that they did in securing their right to bargain collectively and form their own unions. Not a perfect bill, but it's definitely progress, and really looking forward to continuing to work with legislative staff to realize that. We also worked on, and I kind of put this in quotes for lack of a better word, but like post-COVID services bills, particularly ones around public sector workers being made whole for loss of cost of living adjustments last year. So the legislature made investments in wages there that we appreciated, and ensuring that our schools are in a firm financial, have a firm financial basis on which to recover from the ongoing pandemic. And again, really appreciate the work of both Democratic caucuses on delivering on those really important bills. And then doing some of the really complicated work around clean energy, particularly around siting and permitting energy resources, and doing it in a way that doesn't silence communities, doesn't deny tribes their right to real government-to-government consultation, and doesn't undermine the Environmental Protection Act. And I thought we were quite successful in navigating that, and we're very pleased to be working with Representative Fitzgibbon and on advancing that bill. A couple that were real heartbreakers, though, and was deeply, deeply disappointed to see the healthcare staffing bill die in the Senate. That is just such a critical piece of legislation, and no fault of Senator Kaiser or Senator Saldaña, who dug really deep on that one. But that is it's missed opportunity does not even begin to describe the disappointment there. There was also a bill that would have reauthorized labor and industries to establish health and safety rules around ergonomic standards, which was brought to us by a group of cleaning workers at hospitals and in kind of the downtown business district. These account for something like 40% of all workplace injuries. And in this sector, it's particularly and very deeply felt when those workers get injured. The workers' comp benefits they get just aren't enough to hold them through. And we really want to make sure that they're avoiding those injuries. That was filibustered on the House floor for about 9.5 hours in the middle of the night. And then House Democrats were able to advance that one. And unfortunately, it wasn't able to move any further. And then a esoteric bill around protecting workers who have to undergo independent medical examinations, which I won't get too deep into, but it was the third year we had that one, and the third year it didn't advance. So time will tell as to what next year looks like. We'll certainly be bringing back some version of the ergonomics bill. I think people are still kind of strategizing around what healthcare staffing might look like next year. But those issues are not going away. So we're looking forward to advancing those causes. Thank you.
And I guess I'll pick up where Joe left off. Hi, everyone. I'm Brenda Wiest. I'm Vice President of Teamsters Local 117, and I also serve on the board of the Drivers Union, which is affiliated with us. For those who are not familiar with the Drivers Union represents the interests of Uber and Lyft drivers, as well as taxi cab operators in Seattle, King County, and hopefully soon statewide. Folks who are really focused on passenger transportation in the for-hire driving space. And then Teamsters, I would say, we represent it from A to Z. My local alone represents folks who are employed in airlines all the way to the zookeepers at Woodland Park Zoo, and everything in between. So you name it, we're probably, touching it, doing it, delivering it, making it something. And I guess the thing that for me was very, very labor intensive this session was House Bill 2076 that started in the House with Representative Berry, and then Senator Saldaña was able to help us get across the finish line. And that bill outlined a statewide regulatory framework for Uber and Lyft drivers, which is a whole lot of nonsense words that said, Uber and Lyft drivers have jobs here in Washington state, and they deserve the same social safety nets that every worker in the state of Washington deserves. And they also deserve to maintain pay rates that were started in the city of Seattle and have those expanded throughout the state of Washington. This was a first in the nation kind of bill that not only preserved the drivers' highest pay in the nation that they achieved through the city of Seattle, but also will allow drivers to access paid sick days on a permanent basis statewide. It will give drivers access to workers' compensation. It will also give drivers access, after we're done with our task force work, access to the paid family leave program here in Washington. And although drivers, a number of them through the pandemic, were eligible through our Employment Security Department to receive real unemployment, not just pandemic unemployment, this bill will, through its task force, will create another bill that will ensure that drivers who work part-time have all of their hours and earnings count towards their base year so that they're eligible to get unemployment, which is particularly important for folks in low-wage jobs who don't necessarily have all of those hours and earnings on their side jobs count towards their unemployment benefits if they're laid off. And we know so many folks were impacted in the low-wage service sector during the pandemic, and in many places are still struggling to come back. So it was very exciting. I think the last thing I would say about that bill is that here in Washington state, if you don't have a contract or a collective bargaining agreement to protect you, if you suddenly find yourself terminated from your employment, there are very few avenues that you have, unless you have a union, to get your job back, unless your employer broke the law. But everybody who has a union has something that's called just cause, which means they have to have a real reason for firing you. And now, because of House Bill 2076, every driver in the state of Washington that is deactivated must be deactivated for cause. And if there is a problem with that deactivation, they will be referred to the Driver Resolution Center, which exists in Seattle currently, so that they can figure out why they were deactivated. If it was a paperwork problem, if it was a false allegation, if it was a software glitch, they actually have someone who can advocate for them. And having that just cause provision for those drivers really means that they, unlike every other at-will employee in the state of Washington, have a remedy to resolve their issues. And that was a tremendous labor victory for our drivers. There are at any given time nearly 40,000 people who drive on a platform in the state of Washington. So this was a really huge impact, and a number of these folks, of course, live in Senator Saldaña's district. And in her previous life, working at SAGE, she had partnered with our union over the years for the past decade to try and expand and grow driver rights, because so many of the folks who do this work on a full-time basis are immigrants and folks from the refugee community. So it was a huge, huge victory, and we're very excited to go through the rulemaking process and see what the task force brings us. The last bill that I wish had gotten further, well, it may still be a blessing in disguise that it didn't, was a bill that would have required greater transparency at Amazon. I mean, it didn't say Amazon, but it was targeted towards very, very large warehouse and distribution facilities. Again, a little bit wonky for regular people, but Amazon warehouses are called fulfillment centers, and they're these sort of, mega supersized places that workers go to and, put stuff on belts and load trucks, and it comes out to our house. Because the pace is so high inside those facilities, and because workers have so little voice, Amazon accounted for, I can't even tell you what the percentage increase was, but such a great increase in injuries in the warehousing sector that everyone else that worked in the warehousing industry saw their workers' compensation rates go up by a double-digit rate increase if they had been able to account for all of those injuries. So labor and industries created its own risk class for Amazon, and this bill would have required the company to provide information about its standards for how fast you had to pick your order. It would have required them to allow worker participation regularly in their safety committee meetings. It was very minor and modeled after some legislation in California, and there's a bunch of different laws that are being worked on in other states. That bill did not make it out of the Senate either, but I know that we will come back next year with a much stronger version that we'll be able to work on in both the House and the Senate. So that was a disappointment for Teamsters, and I think as we go into this year, looking at how Amazon is growing out and how top of mind it is, we should have more success next year. And of course, the ergonomic bill that Joe referenced was another big priority we wish we had seen pass.
Thank you so much. And, I know we're going to run out of time, and I really do, but I do want to make sure those people, if anyone has just joined us, what we're in the middle of is a community roundtable. And for me, it's really important that I bring the voices into the conversation that brought the legislation or that are directly impacted by policy that we're working on. And so we will keep on going, but please, be mindful. And I want to show our constituents, right, how many issues. The 37th is filled with brilliant people that care about a lot of different issues that impact our residents, our neighbors. And so with that, I want to bring in Elisa Buchanan from One America, who will share about the immigrant unemployment insurance bill that we introduced this year, and anything else in terms of priorities, good, bad, and ugly. Go for it.
Thank you, Senator Saldaña. Hello, everyone. My name is Elisa Buchanan. I use she, her pronouns. I am the policy counsel with One America, and One America is also a part of the Washington Immigrant Relief Fund Coalition, which is where, along with community members, is where the unemployment for our undocumented workers campaign started. So that's what I'm here to talk to y'all about, and I'm going to take us back to 2020. I know that time has no meaning anymore, so that might take a second, but when the pandemic hit, one of the first things we heard from community members was that they had nowhere to turn when layoffs started. Particularly undocumented immigrants were excluded from all forms of federal relief under a hostile federal government. And sorry if y'all hear background noise, the perils of working from home. Undocumented workers were excluded from all forms of federal relief and had nowhere to turn on the state level. And this really just highlighted an existing problem and something we've been hearing from other folks on this call as well, which is a lack of a social safety net for those most vulnerable in our communities. So we started this campaign to fight for unemployment insurance for undocumented workers. It's deeply rooted in the needs and demands from community members and was vetted. The policies that we started presenting to our legislature were vetted in community and formed through partnership with community members. So that is what I wanted to start with, just to make sure that we're grounded in the origins of the bill, which was in 2020. Unfortunately, the bill died in committee, despite Senator Saldaña's excellent sponsorship and championship of it, in the same spot 2 years in a row. And so that was a huge disappointment. It is still the bill that everyone asks us about anytime we're out amongst community members. So it will continue to be our priority as we move forward. One of the main challenges around the bill, at least this year, was the timing, right? It was a very short session. The bill would have had a budgetary impact, and then there were still some questions around the funding for it. As we know, folks pay into the unemployment insurance system. Undocumented workers pay into the unemployment insurance system, but have no way of actually getting the benefits due to their immigration status. So that is one of the main things we want to remedy, but one of the main issues we still have to contend with, because employers cannot be seen due to federal immigration law as employing undocumented workers. So this is something that we continue to work on at the policy level with partners in state agencies and the governor's office. And we will bring this bill back again next year. One of the wins and things that I really like to lift up is that even though the bill did not get passed in the legislature in 2021, we did get a study and worked with ESD last interim on coming up with a policy and a report. And so that involved ESD having a lot of stakeholder meetings with orgs like, Washington Immigrant Solidarity Network, One America, Senator Saldaña.
Employment Security Department.
Yes, Employment Security Department, as well as other agencies. And the key thing there was that Employment Security Department had to do community listening sessions with directly impacted community members. They had never run a Zoom with interpretation before. And they hadn't really had opportunity to directly engage with community members. So this was a huge win, in that they heard directly from folks who are impacted why the policy was necessary, why privacy protections are ultimately necessary, particularly for folks who are undocumented, and why their policy needs to be grounded in the needs of community and cannot simply live in a wonky policy land. So we are hoping to continue that work with the agencies and with Senator Saldaña's office over the interim, and come back with an even bigger, bolder, and stronger bill for the next session. So I'm very excited for that and looking forward to any questions folks may have around this bill.
Thank you so much. And with that, I'm going to pass it on to Emija Smith to talk a little bit about the work around 1169 and post-conviction reform work that you've been a part of for many, many years.
Well, thank you. My name is Emija Smith. Please call me Emija. I consider myself a community queen in the community. I'm from the 37th, born in the 37th, live in the 37th legislative district. And I will say some of the work that I've been able to do in the many capacities. I wear a lot of different hats, but I'm just going to speak first from the legislative state level, is really bringing together a legislative summit. Power to the People was a Black advocacy summit, bringing people across the state to really talk about varying issues, to build collective power around organizing. Similar process, pretty much the same process that Jazzy B just had shared as joining that particular event. But the goal is to really inform community members across the state, and really relevant down here in the 37th legislative district, how the state legislature even works, what our legislators even do, right? Senator Saldaña is wonderful. She's engaged, right? We see her in community. And I believe that's what all our leadership should continue to do. But oftentimes we, as our average community members, just get a little bit confused on where that work stems and how it trickles down to our local communities. So that's something that happens that I do. In my hat, I'm Chief of Staff of King County Equity now. And so we do a lot of campaigns that support organizations across the state, but particularly here in King County, campaigns to help support organizations getting their campaigns out, getting visualized, getting individuals connected to that work. So that is where our strength and our power is in terms of building a base and helping them connect. A lot of the work that I'm really focused on is education, advocacy, and justice reform. So I was invited here to talk somewhat about sentencing reform. There's lots of legislative bills that were up around that. 1169 was about, I believe, gun enhancements. And I don't want to take too much of our time, but oftentimes if you are if you're convicted of a crime that was utilized a weapon, you can get an enhancement. And the way that our state runs currently, those enhancements run back to back, right? If you get sentenced 5 years, but you've gotten 5 enhancements, you're going to get 25 years. Even if you're only, the true crime you're charged with might have been something a lot less than that, right? Vehicular something, assault or something like that. And you oftentimes have to do that time on the gun enhancements before you even do the time of what you're truly being charged for. And what we have found in terms of looking at racial justice, the disproportionality of that impacts the Black community in such an alarming rate. I mean, you just have to see the numbers. It's ridiculous. So we wanted to do some racial justice reform around that. That bill did not pass. It made it through, I believe, the House, but it did not make it through the Senate. These types of reform initiatives that I try to advocate for are really to correct the harms of the war on drugs, the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, the over-policing, those crime bills. And so our legislature during the Black Lives Matters, the wake of George Floyd, people became woke, as if you want to term it, and had made some progress there. And so that work needs to continue. The seed planting needs to continue to keep that moving forward. And it takes people like myself and others who are impacted by such sentencing, whose communities are impacted directly by that, to speak up and get involved and get engaged to educate, because one person cannot do it alone. And so I do want to thank Senator Saldaña for understanding that plight that's happened to BIPOC community and be an advocate for that. There's other bills, again, not much passed at all. That was a huge challenge this legislative session, but we want to go in and continue to educate ourselves and get informed to make our voices strong and to utilize the power of our voice in our advocacy. That's pretty much what I want to share. I think other people here in this space will be sharing their advocacy that is tied to racial justice, that is tied to those harms that were occurred before, and moving that forward.
That's correct. We have a couple more folks that might touch on it from different perspectives. So the next two we'll probably have it, will be definitely in that same body of work. So first is Roxana Gomez. Next will be Jim Buchanan. Roxana works for the ACLU of Washington, and they work from Voting Rights Act to a lot of partnering with the community around police accountability reforms that Emija spoke to just recently, that we finally made some progress last year, and a big part of the fight this year was to try to hold the line and try to get some more, move ourselves a bit forward. So with that, Roxana, I'll let you share, and then we'll move on to our next speakers. Thank you everyone for being with us here tonight.
Yes, thank you, Senator Saldaña. My name is Roxana Gomez. I use she, her pronouns. I'm with the ACLU of Washington, and I'm a proud resident of the 37th Legislative District. So it's always great being in these community spaces. So the ACLU works on a lot of issues, as Senator Saldaña noted, but I did just want to touch on very briefly on a couple of things that we have continued to advocate for reform at the state legislature. So Emija mentioned sentencing reform. This is now, I think, maybe the third or fourth year in a row that we haven't had comprehensive sentencing reform in our state. So it's not just the sentencing enhancements bill, it was the Good Time Bill 1282, a couple of juvenile justice bills that were not moved forward. And, we know that once young adults have contact with the criminal legal system, they continue to have contact with the criminal legal system. So finding alternatives is a way to reduce that contact and ensure that youth are, growing up to be adults and do not interact with the system in that way. Another thing I wanted to mention was around solitary confinement. You wouldn't think about it, but I think this session and really this pandemic has really made people think about what it's like to be isolated from your community. By no means am I trying to, compare solitary confinement with COVID isolation, but in solitary confinement, people are held in spaces for 22 to 23 hours a day without any contact with the outside world. Sometimes they're released directly into the community from solitary confinement. And we have partners and we've worked with people that have experienced solitary confinement to create a space at DOC to make sure that folks are not being sent to solitary confinement as a way to just not deal with them. And by far the biggest group that we're seeing being sent to solitary confinement are folks with disabilities. So that's an area that we want to continue to work with the Department of Corrections on. And in fact, even though there wasn't any legislative action this year, the Department of Corrections was awarded around $7 million in the budget to do some of these improvements in their facilities. So we'll, would love to follow up with you on that, Senator Saldaña, to make sure that we're holding DOC accountable to that. So with those two topics briefly touched on, I do just want to touch on the bulk of my work, which is around police accountability. And Senator Saldaña, you mentioned this year was really about holding the line on the reforms that we passed in 2021. And for folks that weren't following the historic passage of over a dozen police accountability bills in 2021, it really was historic. And unfortunately, we got to that level because we had to witness something on camera so egregious. But, for us and for the impacted family members that I work with, we don't think that this window of police reform has closed. We're continuing to propose ideas to take police from the equation. Not everything requires a police response. So with that being said, I do want to mention two things. If you leave with anything from today, two stats that I want you to carry with you. One of them is when we passed the reforms in 2021, not even a year later, we had seen a 60% reduction in police killings in Washington state. So compare that to any other year in that same time frame. We saw a significant reduction, and that was enough reason for us to, tell the legislature, let's not work to roll back these bills so fast. And unfortunately, that was sort of the momentum that we were filled with. As soon as these bills passed in 2021, we were met with a misinformation campaign, a disinformation campaign about what law enforcement could and could not respond to. And when we think about this, we have to think about who holds the power of communication and the trust of communities. So that's why our coalition worked really hard to do some myth busting about what House Bill 1310 and 1054 reformed and what it did not. This past session, we were really operating from a harm reduction perspective. Unfortunately, House Bill 2037 did pass. I know Senator Saldaña was a huge advocate on our side to make sure that the bill did not advance. And for folks that don't know about House Bill 2037, that bill allowed officers to use force when someone flees an investigatory stop. What's an investigatory stop? That's a traffic stop That's basically any sort of questioning. And when we think about why people run from law enforcement, you have to think about the historical components, right? Why are Black, Indigenous, and people of color scared of the police? It's because of this racist legacy that is when we think of law enforcement. So there's just so much to talk on right there. I feel like we need to do a whole other conversation on this. But moving forward, I did just want to mention our coalition, the ACLU, we're really interested in working on traffic stops reform. If you don't know, traffic stops are the #1 way that police come in contact with civilians. And sometimes they come in contact with you for things that you could get just, a fine mailed to you, like expired tabs or something hanging from your rear view window. And sometimes those traffic stops escalate and lead to death. So with all that being said, that's what I wanted to talk about. Thank you, Senator Saldaña, for the invitation.
Thank you, Roxana. And I think just on this piece, right, I mean, there's a lot of work that needs to happen during this interim, and on the issue in terms of reform and review, just wanted to let folks know that I will be appointed to the Joint Legislative Task Force on Jail Standards. And so as you know, I will definitely be partnering in terms of looking at that $7 million, how it gets invested, but also hearing and getting closer to folks that are incarcerated and making sure that their voices and their perspectives are centered as we think about preparing for next session. With that, thank you so much for those that are still here waiting to speak. Jim Buchanan, I've come to know and through the work that the 37th has really said is a priority, which is equity in cannabis. This is an industry that, in terms of talking about the criminalization and the war on drugs and the disproportionate impact on our Black and Brown communities. And as this industry has now been legalized for the last 7 years, how we make sure that it is equitable and that Black and Brown individuals in particular and our communities see benefit from that. And Jim has been a leader, a champion, and creates context to make things different than what we thought was possible. He helps change the environment to make more possible. So with that, I will pass it on to Jim Buchanan.
Oh my God. Wow, what an introduction. Thank you. Yeah, we all have a tough job, but if we don't do it, who will, at the end of the day. I'm Jim Buchanan, president of the Washington State African American Cannabis Association. And that organization kind of started organically. It really wasn't planned. We dealt with 1.5 years of taunting and grueling meetings with the task force, which Senator Saldaña is a task force member and has been very instrumental in moving the cannabis line in the sand. We had 2 bills that we were focusing on. One was for licensing, and the licensing consisted of trying to make the space in cannabis more equitable. We have over 1,800 licenses. And for retail, there are about 560, and 8 of them have African American presence on them. And producer processors, there's like 3 out of 1,300. So we have been victimized by the war on drugs, which it all ties together. That we're talking about prison reform or injustice, and we're going to jail and prison 4-to-1. But yet, when the economic opportunity that came to be able to do legal cannabis, we're locked out of the process. So we have a lot of times in social equity, we fight. It's easier, or I don't want to say easy because none of it's easy, but the path of most resistance is economics. We start talking about digging in to economics, then it becomes a whole nother animal. We have 57 House representatives in the state of Washington that are Democrat, 41 Republican, but equity wasn't at the top of the list for the Democrats. And equity regarding economic justice was not at the top for licensing. So we had our House bill for the licensing, went through Commerce and Gaming, passed through that, it passed through appropriations. And when it passed through appropriations, they went, oh, they're serious. So then the opposition came full force. We saw the opposition, it came in rules and it died in rules, literally died. The very people that told us how they were in support of it, that they knew that it should happen and they're all for it, start hiding. And the vote started swaying a different way. The whole vibe changed. And we were distraught by that because, you know, when we're going to prison, not have been to prison, are still going to prison right now today as we speak, some people are being arrested that shouldn't be, that are primarily African-American and also Hispanic and also other folks of color. But the state statistics show the African-Americans and Hispanics are affected the most. Folks are just not interested in legislation and doing that. And some of the reason is we got heavy opposition from folks that don't want it to happen because remember, again, it's economics. You start talking about messing with people's dead presidents, then their whole vibe changes. You know, the only color they really see then is green. You know, so, you know, that died and we're going to ferociously be back at it, you know, for this next session to demand equity and equality. The other area was community reinvestment fund. We knew that in 2 years, 2020 and 21, there was over $1 billion of cannabis tax money revenue that was basically in the bank, you know, ready to be allocated. And we felt strong that 50% of that money should come to the communities that have been impacted by the war on drugs. And we got that recommendation, you know, from the task force, and Senator Saldaña was really instrumental in, you know, helping push that through and get that through. But then we came out with bills that, you know, were asking, we talked to Governor Inslee and he said that he would put $125 million in his supplemental budget and propose that, and he did. And so we had two bills. One was a House bill, and the other was a Senate bill, which Senator Saldaña sponsored. And both of those, I think, struggled, you know, and end up not making it through. But the House bill, at the very last second, we were able to get the money moved into the budget. It went through the House, it went through the Senate, it got on the House floor and started gathering difficulties on the Senate floor, and started gathering difficulties. But then the senators, and thank you, Senator Saldaña, were able to get that money, $400 million, pushed into the governor's budget, which we won. So we had a big hit in the head on a loss, and we got a win, you know, at the end. And that win represents $200 million, the fiscal year 2023, which starts in July, and also $100 million in fiscal year 2024, and another $100 million in 2025. But they have to push through and still be voted on the 200 millions. But you know, it's legislation. It was my first legislation just really going at it. And it was a short one, but a long one and a hard one. And then when it's over, you know, it's almost like you don't really understand yet, have you won or lost? Right. You know, unless it's a hard definition. It takes, you know, some unwinding or something to come around. Mm-hmm. Wow, look what we've got. You know, so we got that. You know, we got the money. You know, mm-hmm. Senator Saldaña, I'm sure you got a lot of questions. She can explain more to you, you know, later. You know, but we'll be coming back at them next year, you know, for more consistent money. So, you know, I'll take this time to say it was a great learning experience. You know, we didn't get everything we want, but we feel good about it because we're coming back at them to get it. And we know we're going to get it, and we're going to get more. And we appreciate and we need everybody's support on this call. Definitely. So again, Community Reinvestment Fund, $200 million, fiscal year 2023. It'll be out as for stuff like first-time buyers to be able to have a deposit to get into a home. prison reinvestment, reentry program to help folks get back into the system.
Yep.
Economic development was our primary focus on what we wanted it for grants for businesses, for grants for non-traditional businesses, not for the person that always got that RFP, you know, that they got that business stack, they're doing 3, 4 million, 10 million a year or whatever. No, it's for that business that it just really needs it to grind out to get over the edge and to get over the line. And so we can further the economic stretch in our communities. The only way we're really going to make that happen is if we stretch with economics and show our kids how to stretch with economics and are able to pass that along to them. So that's our goal and objective.
Thank you so much, Mr. Buchanan.
Thank you very much, Senator Saldaña.
Yeah, and I think what is great about having the variety of bills and speakers and community groups coming forward is how you define success, right? And how really, as much as I came from the outside pushing, how much this democracy really depends on continued engagement, and the struggle it is when we're community people, you know, trying to engage with it, and we don't have necessarily the resources, the funds, the history. And so, but I think that is the part of that I just want to highlight in this particular situation is that we got the budget one time, but plussed up. We have the definition of that community reinvestment, and we have also through this interim the new Office of Equity that is going to be working with by and for community leaders to build the case of, you know, where this funding, you know, the community reinvestment fund criteria as the community has identified it, and build the case for why this needs to be not just one time but ongoing. And so I'm very much looking forward to that interim work. We're going to move on, and we have 3 more people that we want to get in, and then we're going to see if there's any initial questions just for follow-up, and then we'll go to the community questions that have been coming in. Thank you. With that, I'm going to invite Anna Zivarts from Disability Rights Washington to speak, and after her will be Guillermo Rogel from Front and Centered.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. Anna here. She, her pronouns. I'm the director of the Disability Mobility Initiative. We're a program hosted by Disability Rights Washington, and we are in a statewide organizing project focused on organizing non-drivers to advocate for better transportation access. We talk about non-drivers broadly, not just folks who are disabled and can't drive because of a disability, but also we want to include in that youth, people who are too young to drive, can't afford a driver's license or a car, people who are aging out of driving, people who don't drive for any other reason. And so we think we're at least a quarter of the state's population. And so part of our work this legislative session, we've been organizing for about 2 years with Disability Rights Washington, and through a story map, through collecting and organizing folks, convinced the governor's office and legislators to fund a study on the demographics of non-drivers. So that's in the proviso that was in the transportation budget, transportation package, and that's that will help us start to understand better our needs to make sure that we're that's actually part of the conversation when we're thinking about, okay, we're gonna, you know, spend billions and billions on highways. What about billions on transit service? What about billions on connected sidewalks? I'm here in the 37th district. And yeah, just thinking about, you know, all the streets that don't have sidewalks, that don't have curb ramps, all the, you know, the places that we could have better transit service, like, you know, service that connects east-west over to Georgetown from where I live, or in the Rainier Valley, or, you know, connecting south more easily so you don't have to go downtown to take a bus to Tacoma. Thinking about those things. And so, yeah, it was great to work in this session to get that particular proviso included. We also worked really closely with Front and Centered, and you'll hear from Guillermo in a minute, about some of our work with them, so I'll let him cover that. But the transportation package ended up being a big part of our focus. We wanted to make sure that there was as much funding as possible in there for transit and paratransit and active transportation. That's the way we walk and roll and get around our communities. And that we limited the amount of funding we were putting towards highway expansion, recognizing that, not only do highways have really detrimental health impacts to BIPOC communities, low-income communities that are next to those highways, but also they create a lot of access barriers for folks who are trying to walk and roll around them. And one example of that here in the 37th is on Rainier, as you're approaching what will soon be that Judkins Park light rail station. You have to cross the on-ramps or the off-ramps of the I-90, and those are pretty scary as a pedestrian to try to cross. There's one you have to cross already to get to the 7 stop. And so really thinking about how can we start to create systems where it's easy and comfortable for folks who don't have the privilege of driving to get around. So I'm going to keep it brief because I have a little one. So I'm going to end it there and pass it on to Guillermo to talk about our work. But I guess one shout out for next session. We're still figuring that out, but one thing we might try to do, and we did last year, was this Week Without Driving Challenge, where Senator Saldaña and a bunch of other electeds joined us to try to spend a week without driving themselves in a vehicle. And so we're trying to explore whether we could get that institutionalized as a state program. So thinking about that to really make it something that lasts beyond our little nonprofit budget restrictions. So pass it to Guillermo if he's next. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Ana and Guillermo. Please share some of your highlights and lessons and challenges.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you, Ana. Great partners with Disability Rights Washington. And thank you, Senator Saldaña, for having us here tonight. It's great to partner with you on many different pieces of legislation. So like I said, my name is Guillermo Rogel. I am with Front and Center. We are a coalition of 70 community-based organizations across Washington state who are rooted in communities of color. And so for us, we recognize that the climate crisis is here, but really climate solutions moving forward need to center communities that are frontline communities that are impacted first and worst by pollution. So as Ana mentioned, the transportation system, it's where Washington state gets most of its carbon emissions. So if we are talking about reducing carbon emissions and at the same time reducing health disparities, because where you are, your zip code affects, the way that you are experiencing this climate crisis. Some folks are a lot better equipped to handle a climate crisis. So if there's increased heat, maybe they have access to air conditioning, maybe they can go somewhere different. But for low-income populations who are just, stuck at their zip codes, who maybe don't have access to different resiliency and weatherization in their house or in their communities, are going to be affected worse than other folks. So for us, it's really about reducing those disparities and health disparities specifically. This session, I learned quite a few things. It was the second time that we were in a hybrid remote session. And in a lot of ways that increased access for the public. So if you were able to go in and testify in a committee or meet with members across Washington who maybe you had to drive to Olympia to actually meet with them, we have increased access. But then that also comes, its challenges too. There are a lot of decisions that are made behind the scenes among different folks in leadership that we just don't have access to in the ways that we used to when we could actually see action going on in Olympia. In Washington, I think one of the wins that we had, just building off of what Ana said, the transportation package that passed had great investments in public transit and active transportation. So we can actually move people differently than just relying on cars, especially for folks who can't drive. But at the same time, there are still investments in highways and road expansions that we think are going to lock in emissions in different communities that are already facing pollution and these health disparities. So in going into next year, what we're doing with Front and Centered and with the Department of Transportation, I think the one I want to highlight is a proviso that's going to set a baseline standard for frequent and accessible transit in Washington. So here we don't have a standard of transportation in Washington. And what we see that as is someone can get to work, someone can get back to work. If you missed your bus, if you missed your train, it can come back again in 15 minutes. And that it's walkable and accessible by many different methods, at least a half mile from where that bus stop is, from where that train stop is. So that's something that we're trying to do, is just set a standard for Washington. So if you're in Pierce County and King County, you have access to the standard that Washington is moving towards. So, looking towards next year to reduce those emissions and reduce those health disparities, and really seek investments into our community, because the climate crisis is here, and we really need to protect our communities and move towards a transition away from the bad and invest in what we know is going to be good, clean, and fair for Washington.
Thank you so much, Guillermo. And our last presenter for this evening, and then we'll start more conversation, is Rebecca Berry, Executive Director of the Skyway Coalition. And I'll pass it on to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Senator Saldaña. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really happy to be here. My name is Rebecca Berry, and I use she and her pronouns. And I'm really honored to serve my community with the Skyway Coalition. So Skyway, as some of you may know, is an unincorporated area of King County. So this means that we lack a lot of access to basic community services, resources, and representation that incorporated cities benefit from. So we're kind of newer to the game in working with state advocacy and working to get support and funds with Senator Saldaña. And we recently had some wins this past year advocating for some support to renovate a community building that was donated to our community, to community ownership. We received funding to support the renovation of the Skyway Resource Center. And we also received funding to support an outdoor preschool in Skyway called Pita Village. And as an unincorporated community, we get our first layer of representation, not at the city level, but at the county level, and then followed by the state level. So we have had other wins recently at the county level in getting $10 million to support community center, $5 million to support affordable housing, and a portion of a $10 million pot in a participatory budgeting program, as well as marijuana tax revenue to reinvest into our community. And we're really just getting started. Like I said, we're happy to see funding starting to come our way, but we really need much more to be as impactful as we all need and aspire to be. Some of the gaps that we've identified in the community recently is that there's a huge divide between the legislative authorization of funding and the funding actually reaching the communities. So for example, Pita Village and Skyway Resource Center, I'm not even sure that we've received the funding. There's a big need for support with technical assistance for first-time awardees going through that contracting process. Navigating the different requirements of contracting took us from July through to February, For communities like Skyway, it really helps to keep the community engaged and keep that momentum by potentially being able to finalize those funding contracts as soon as possible. Bureaucratic processes hurt communities just by simply the time it takes to process those new plans. Another gap that I'd like to point out that we experienced was the advocacy that we did to get county funds where we haven't received the funding yet. We have a $5 million in affordable housing, and timelines with government agencies, particularly affordable housing dollars, could be impactful in that displacement is really challenging our community. And then it doesn't really align for us to follow up with the state budgeting and legislative sessions for more advocacy and to show the impact of the money that would be used when advocating for more funding. So largely, we've really enjoyed working with Senator Saldaña on a number of other efforts. She's been really integral in supporting our bringing in more affordable home ownership opportunities. We're excited to sign a memorandum of understanding led by a community committee in our neighborhood and several redistricting efforts to make sure that we were able to stay under the representation of Senator Saldaña. Our proven and strong partnership is really valued, and just appreciate being in this space today. So thank you.
Thank you so much. And So for those that are joining and listening in, this is our community roundtable that we've brought 10 different organizations and groups together to share from their perspective what went well this legislative session, what we need to improve upon, where are the gaps, and what should we be thinking about as we are preparing for this interim and getting ready for the next legislative session. So we've heard from folks. I wonder, I think at this point, we're going to move towards the questions that we've received. I've asked one of our communications director, Aaron Wasser, if he can read out the questions for us. I'm happy to take the lead on many of them, as they might be specifically for me, but definitely want to welcome all of our panelists. If there's one that you feel inspired to respond to, it's important for our community to hear, because one of my goals with this is that organizing does not stop. Democracy does not stop when the legislative session ends. In many ways, that's when the hardest work begins, because it's about the implementation. So I'll just say, like, what I love about the Doulas for All campaign is the fact that they use the language of what it means to, like, be prenatal, to think about health and wellness while you're birthing, the birthing process, and then the postpartum, right? And the postpartum, as we know, for those of us that have had the honor to birth people into this world, can be the hardest, because everyone's just like, well, you're done, we'll just drop you off there, and like that's where, like, a lot of things can be missed, is if you're not paying attention to the health of the people, but also the in this case, right, the product of the policy, and who's taking care of it. Often it's in hands of agency folks that you don't even know, and so I think that's the piece that I really love about their approach to the legislative process. But I think it's something that all of us can be thinking about, is how do we help each other, because that implementation process is hard, and if one other group is already going to some meeting, can they be tracking some of the work together, because it is a team effort, this democracy, and really appreciate the opportunity to work with the people that are here and the many people that are listening here today. So with that, I will go ahead and say, Aaron, is there a first question?
There is. Thank you. And thank you to everybody that sent in a question. If you are watching, please feel free to enter your question into the chat on the platform you're watching. We'll try to get to you. The first question is about renewable energy. And the question is, can you pass legislation requiring new buildings to incorporate environmentally friendly measures such as solar panels?
So what I can say is anything is possible. And a few years ago, we did a first round of trying to get to address cleaner buildings. And we had this year about 3 different bills that did not make it all the way through. We had one, the clean energy, that did advance. But I think that there are, so yes, we must. And I think we will continue to do that work. In the meantime, I just want to highlight 2 bills that did make it through that start, that give us some progress. One was to make sure that if there are parking lots, that they have the ability to put solar in. I was down in Fresno, California, and all of the high school parking lots have solar installed there to be able to capture energy right then. And another bill from our new Senator Trudeau, was to look at how do we make sure that we build affordable housing, and where there's parking lots, to be able to use those lots in particular to turn it into affordable housing, and why not put solar on top of those buildings, right? So those were 2 pieces of legislation that did move it forward, but we have to come back and do some comprehensive work going forward. And I do believe that there is a building code council that is non-elected, but appointed by the governor and they oversee some of this, and they did just made some decision that does allow some advancement around clean energy, including solar on buildings, before we get back to legislative session.
Great. Our next question is about the pandemic's impact on schools. The pandemic had lasting effects on education, students, schools, and educators. One of our community members is concerned about supports for substitute educators. Could anyone speak on addressing support for educators and specifically our substitute teachers?
I'll look and see. I might call into Emija too. I mean, I do think what we did this year was try to give our school districts as much flexibility as possible to make sure that there's no, that they are able to apply it to what they need in each of their districts. Our districts are locally controlled. And so I think that there's a question really here in terms of if a substitute works so many hours, to make sure that they actually have access to healthcare and more protections. And I believe we did some of that, but perhaps the question is whether that's actually ongoing or whether it's sufficient. And I'm looking to see, because we also had some bills around transportation and bus drivers in this space as well, in terms of folks that are, this is actually Educator Appreciation Week. But I think a lot of times we don't think about all the folks that it takes to actually make the education work for our kids. And so I think that's been a piece, whether it's paraeducators or substitute teachers, is making sure that all of them have access to a good working conditions with actual respect and the proper wages. I don't know if there's any, I see a Brenda and maybe Emija just popped on too. So do you have anything to add on this one?
I would add that for some time there's been work and labor to secure healthcare benefits for school bus drivers, whether they are contracted out or in-house, making sure that they have access to fair healthcare, but that also in terms of protecting people's working conditions, the ergonomics rulemaking bill, Joe did not mention this, but it has a huge impact on the custodial and maintenance staff that work inside the schools. And again, those are the lower wage tiers in the non-classified staff that really is, needs extra protections and more access to rights.
Great, thank you. And Emija, do you have?
I think the only thing that I would add would be that thinking about the negotiations with the unions, and not sure if all substitutes are part of a union or not, but I would support and be open to that, advocating on the local level and district level to ensure that our substitute teachers who are filling gaps, particularly in this pandemic, and coming to ensure that our students are being educated, are being supported with the resources and support services that they need to support our schools. Because this past school year, schools were shutting down, different schools were shutting down, teachers needed to, take care of themselves. And so we heavily relied on our substitute pool to keep our kids' education moving forward. So I think it's a great question. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for weighing in. Aaron?
Yes, our next question is about behavioral health. May is Mental Health Month. What did the legislature do to support behavioral health in Washington?
Yes, so, and again, I'll definitely look to others as well. But a couple of things that we've been doing for the last few years is making sure that we're updating our healthcare system to recognize and treat mental health and behavioral health as actual health care and health issues that should not be criminalized or shamed, but need to be centered. We've also, of course, been moving forward to make sure that our schools are teaching social emotional and are culturally competent in how they show up for our students. This year, we plussed up a lot of funding for behavioral health. We continue to support housing first models. And I'll say, like, the other piece is, of course, we funded for more significantly nurses and counselors in our school districts. Are a few of the things that we were able to do this legislative session.
Senator Saldaña, may I add?
Yeah.
I believe with regard to the Department of Corrections, there was also some funding that was sent there intentionally around behavioral health supports. That's my understanding from this past legislative session. I don't know the bill number, it came out of appropriations, but it seems like there's a lot of advocacy from our leaders there that are centering behavioral health and social emotional health for our citizens. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And on the past question around mental health, we also have one of my colleagues who was with me earlier today, Representative Melins High, talking about the importance of looking at our workforce as a whole, when we're looking at education, when we're looking at mental health, and she has been a huge champion for healthcare equity and immigrant rights, among other things. So thank you so much for joining, because I had invited many of my colleagues. I'm really happy to see her here with us. She represents on the other side of the Lake Washington. And again, like I said, this is a team sport in the legislature, and really making sure that you have allies and accomplices inside and outside of both chambers is critical for us to move policy forward.
Great. Our next question is about ageism. Our respondent asks, I'm struggling with age discrimination while looking for a job. What support is there for someone like me?
Thank you so much for that question. And I'm so sorry that that is your experience. There, of course, is WALAD, which is supposed to, is our Washington state law against discrimination, and making sure that workers have dignity in their workplace, is there to, in terms of the office of, the office that of human rights, and I see Brenda helping me out. The Human Rights Commission is supposed to be there. They need more funding and more capacity and more enforcement. I have supported legislation in the past to make sure that people have teeth, that our laws have teeth, so that workers and their unions or community can speak up on behalf of workers, to make sure that our agencies can enforce, and if they don't enforce, that an individual should be able to bring up that action. I will say the other piece, and I'll see if anyone else wants to add, but we also support, and this is not legislative, but I'll just say there are places where you can call to make sure that you know your rights and are getting good legal advice. And one of those community-based organizations is the Fair Work Center. And so I definitely would say, if you haven't called that line, feel free to call that, or let me know directly by sending me an email, and we will see what we can do from a casework perspective on behalf of in your situation. Anyone else want to add here? Brenda?
I would just add a couple of things, and Senator Saldaña can definitely direct you if you follow up with her. Depending on the employer, if it's a public sector employer, there's likely a union that can help you. Even if it's in the private sector, if it is unionized or non-unionized, you might be able to find help through a labor union. Additionally, there are a number of employment attorneys and legal resources that can help you, and many attorneys will give you a free consult or give you a free referral to someone to get those questions answered, to see if there's like a bigger pattern or practice that's taking place that needs some sort of legal intervention. So there are probably 5 or 6 different rabbit holes you can jump down to get an answer, or at least a direction towards solving those problems.
Great, thank you. Our next question is about healthcare. What are you doing to protect our rights in the face of religious influence over hospitals and other healthcare providers in Washington?
Great question. And this is one that is a concern to me. I've been partnering with labor unions and community organizations. We have had a piece of legislation that Senator Randall, my colleague, has introduced in the past to make sure that we have transparency and accountability about healthcare systems, to make sure that there is not discrimination and that they are providing holistic care for all Washingtonians, regardless of what kind of body they bring in into the facilities. And so that's a bill that I think needs to come back next year. I think the other piece is of course, you know, we are passing legislation to affirm people's that reproductive justice and reproductive rights are healthcare. Abortion is healthcare, and making sure that we're actually providing real access for people across our state. Representative Tai actually is what sponsored piece of legislation to make sure that it is something that is easy to access in our college campuses, because we know that a lot of clinics that provide more holistic care aren't in every part of our state, but we do have more college campuses in parts of our state that help. It can be one way to make it a little bit more accessible.
All right. Up next, we have a question about alternative fuels. Will unions support the transition away from fossil fuels?
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess I can't speak on behalf of all labor, but as someone that comes out of union organizing, I know that there's a lot of unions that support, and we're on the front lines pushing for our HEAL Act, which is our environmental justice statute, that have been engaged in making sure that we get clean fuels, that when we transition in a way that brings all Washingtonians along. And so IBAW, which is the electricians union, has definitely been a champion and leader on all of this policy. A lot of our service sector unions, our transit unions, have been pushing on this. And I think, you know, what's important is that in a democracy, we want our economy to work for all Washingtonians. And so I think part of that has been is like, how do we make a just transition? How do we help people? Because we're all addicted to this capitalism and fuel that pollutes. And, you know, even though I have a hybrid, I still am polluting, right? And so I think these are the things that, you know, we need to build the infrastructure. And that was part of our clean transportation package that we pushed forward this year, is making sure that we're building the infrastructure to allow our communities to have choices that are not polluting. But at the same time, we also need to make sure that as we're transitioning, that our low-income seniors are able to still have heat and AC when they need it. And so I think that's been, you know, I'll say that's what I'm engaging in, is making sure that we get the good policy and making sure that it can implement in a way that still creates high quality careers and opportunities for Washingtonians, and that they have a right to organize in their workplaces, because people spend more time in their job. And if they don't have a democracy there, that makes it really hard for them then to figure out how to engage, or even have to have time off to be able to engage into this democracy.
I'd just add one other thing. I mean, in addition to folks who are union members that are building the infrastructure of roads and, you know, building fuel infrastructure, which, you know, also sadly does include pipelines and oil, etc. There are other people who are union members that, you know, drive for a living, and many of those driving jobs, even though they are union jobs, don't allow them to purchase the you know, vehicles that are less polluting. And so in places like California, they've worked very hard with drayage drivers and through rebates and other funding systems to allow folks who are owner operators or are misclassified to be able to afford less polluting trucks, because really the ports and that transportation segment of our workforce is some of the most polluting and causing the most harm. And so ensuring that there are real rebates and or real ways to access vehicles that run on alternate fuels or are electrified, and also ensuring that the infrastructure is available to people when they live in multifamily housing or apartments, or in the case of passenger transportation, is located near the airports and has fast charging systems for them and rebates for them to be able to get into those vehicles, are other really important things that labor supports and my union and the drivers union and many unions are engaged in working on.
Thank you so much. I know we're at time. Is there one more question I should squeeze in, Aaron, or should we?
Yeah, let's do one last question about housing. Everybody wants to know about housing. So the question is, what is the likelihood that another missing middle housing bill like House Bill 1782 will be introduced next session?
I think the likelihood is very high. I think in terms of getting it to the governor's desk in good shape, requires all of us to be doing some organizing between now and then. But I feel very hopeful that the next thing that we need to do is build strong, updated housing policy. We've done a lot of investing, and hopefully people will starting to see that. You're seeing Hobson Place open up, which has an amazing, healthcare clinic on the first line and housing first above it. You're starting to see some community BIPOC-led land acquisition, land trust, co-op housing ownership, but it takes many years from where the need is. And so I think what we need to do is go back and update our policies to make sure that people have real choices as renters, to be able to afford to stay in places that are wonderful, like the 37th. But that does some organizing. Happy to talk with you offline about all that. This line, I want people to know that this is my last official, probably community roundtable and public communication, because the session is over. May 15th is my cutoff day, because all of the House legislative folks and many of the state senators were up for election. So while I'm still your state senator between now and January 9th, I just want to do an amazing shout out to Coco Chang, my legislative assistant. It is a hard job. She's been doing this work with me for the past 3+ years. She creates, we always try to do this in real life, and we try as best we can through Zoom, and she is master at it, of creating space that feels welcoming, that despite all the barriers, hopefully you're feeling a connection to your state legislature, and that we're trying to get rid of red tape. So I really do appreciate her. Without her, this would not have been possible. And she and I will continue to work, but we won't be able to be out on social media, on our Senate official social media. And I won't be able to host these kinds of gatherings in this formal way, in this public way, so that we can have, because of our good access to democracy and trying to be transparent and accountable that we have in the state of Washington. So I just want to let you know that if you don't see my page as active, it's for a reason, but we're still doing the work. We're still in the community. We're still accepting invitations and to come out and be with community and to work together. So hopefully, if I come back the following year, we can continue to do this good work together. I want to again thank all of our panelists. We will have this up so that people can watch it as they can, and folks can reach out to us. I see that, Emija, would you like to make a closing remark?
I just briefly wanted to say that for people who are coming out for reentry, there used to be these vouchers for renting for 3 months. It's been extended for another 3 months. So that is small progress. It'd be great if it could be at least a year, but I just want to highlight that around the housing piece. Thank you for the space.
Yes, thank you so much. This is why I'm so grateful, because there are many small wins, and we hope that people feel that those are just a step along the way to the kind of justice and the kind of safe communities that we all deserve. And I will just say again, thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you for all those that have joined us today. And we didn't do this at the beginning, but I will close out and making sure that we all take a moment to remember where we are, that we are not just a square on a Zoom, that we are on land, that land was first held sacred and protected and honored by our First Nations and our Indigenous folks that have been here since time immemorial, that I stand on Coast Salish land of the Duwamish and the Muckleshoot, Suquamish, and the Tulalip in my corner of Rainier Beach where I live. But I know all of us are coming from different places and a need to recognize and honor, in particular, those that are here with us today, African Americans, our Black community, and the legacy that we have here in the 37th of speaking up, of resisting, and of making sure that we welcome all people. that this is a place for those that have always been here, and is a place where we will continue to welcome the refugee, the immigrant, and make sure that people have a place that is their home, and we will fight for that. And so I just want to, again, thank you for being a partner. Thank you for doing your work, and thank you for helping me be a better reflection of the beauty that is the 37th. I hope everyone has a great evening, and I